June 14, 1940. Western Desert, 30 miles south of Mersa Matruh. The sand was still cool before sunrise, the kind of pale grey morning that hides distances and flatters arrogance. And at a folding table under a tarpaulin, a German liaison officer finished a report that would age badly within the year. The British armour was timid, he wrote, poorly handled, unsupported by doctrine, incapable of decisive action. His colonel nodded, satisfied. The Italians had advanced into Egypt. The British were outnumbered. The German assessment was simple: a colonial army holding a colonial frontier, not a threat, not to disciplined European arms, not to generals who believed maneuver was a birthright. They had never met the men who would paint a jerboa on their fenders and call themselves the Desert Rats. The road to humiliation in Africa did not begin with triumph or tanks. It began with maps. Empty ones. Desert nothingness that looked like a blank slate to staff officers in Europe and like an ocean to men who had to cross it. The British 7th Armoured Division, hastily assembled from units that knew more about dust than parade grounds, learned the language of that ocean the hard way. Fuel, water, bearings, mirage, wadis, hardpan. They learned to treat the sun as a clock and the wind as a courier. They learned to fight without shade, to sleep with engines ticking as if they were breathing animals, to grease the inside of goggles, and to tuck tea tins in the turret bustle so the water would be warm when it mattered most. What the Germans mocked as colonial improvisation became a doctrine. What they called disorder became tempo. December 1940, Operation Compass. The order sounded small, a 5-day raid to disrupt the Italian 10th Army. But the desert rewards audacity the way the sea rewards seamanship, and the Desert Rats had learned both. They hit the Italian camps at Sidi Barrani like a sandstorm with a compass, Stuart lights skipping like beetles, Matilda II's trudging like iron camels, carriers dragging clouds behind them. The Italians had numbers, trenches, wire, fixed positions. The Rats had direction. They slid around the edges, cut telephone lines, pounded command posts, and kept moving. 5 days became 5 weeks. Camps fell, columns folded, prisoners, tens of thousands, shuffled into pens that had to be scratched out of the gravel with bulldozers. At Bardia and Tobruk, the Rats gnawed the wire at night, and the guns spoke at dawn. By early February 1941, a raid had become a rout, and a general in Rome studied a map that had changed colour. The Germans took notice. They sent a man who loved deserts for the way they punished hesitation. He arrived with a handful of tanks and a talent for theatre, and the British press, eager for a worthy foe, gave him a nickname before his panzers earned their dust: Rommel. He drove like a cavalryman and briefed like a conjurer. He baited, feinted, turned, and in April 1941 he took back what the British had won, and he taught them a lesson they would not forget. Overextension kills. Garrisons caught in sieges bleed armies dry. Pursuit without petrol is a rumour. Tobruk did not fall. The Desert Rats did not vanish. They went to ground, they learned again, and they wrote new margins in the doctrine they were still inventing. Fast patrols now scouted with compasses hung from the neck. Columns carried spare track like necklaces. The jerboa on the fender became a signature. Not cute. Territorial. Operation Crusader, November 1941. The plan was simple and complicated in the way only desert plans can be. Fix the enemy at the wire, cut the road, force a relief, kill the relief. The Desert Rats, now wielding Crusader tanks that gave the operation its name, met panzers in open ground where the horizon looked honest and was not. Gunnery decided first contact, maintenance decided the week, logistics decided the month. German gunners were sharp. British crews learned to be sharper. The Matildas were stubborn beasts, but the Crusaders could run, and a tank that can run can choose the angle of its own death or victory. It was hard. It was expensive. It was learning in blood. But for the first time, Rommel fell back by necessity rather than design, and a British division that had been called timid in German reports now showed a new habit. They refused to be finished. In 1942, the desert made its worst claims. Gazala, the cauldron, a long, armoured knife fight around boxes of fortifications and minefields laid like invisible rivers. The desert rats were carved, and they carved back. They watched columns die on mine belts because someone misread the wind, or the spacing, or the clock that is always ticking in a fuel tank. They fell back past Tobruk. They fell back past the names that newsreaders recognized, and they fell back to a pair of railway stations that did not look like history. Alamein, a line between a salt pan and a sea. No room to turn a flank, no appetite for retreat. The mockery was loud again. In Berlin, they laughed about a British army trapped by geography and led by caution. In Cairo, the desert rats cleaned filters and waited for clarity. It came in the form of a plan that did not flatter genius and a schedule that did not indulge romance. October 1942. The opening barrage at El Alamein sounded like a foundry collapsing, and then the desert became a factory. Infantry with bayonets and shovels, sappers with tape and prodders, feeling for mines like doctors feeling for pulses, tanks in lanes, guns in echelons, rats in the wire. Not a single dramatic swing, but a pressure. A hydraulic force applied with a timetable. The desert rats, now on Shermans and Grants, that brought better guns and better silhouettes to a battlefield that punished both, drove into minefields named with deadpan humor. January, February, March. The names fell off the map. Knightsbridge, Kidney Ridge, Miteria. Artillery did arithmetic. The RAF did persistence. The desert rats did what they had become famous for, without asking for fame. They moved at night. They drank tea out of blackened tins. They kept engines running so oil would not thicken. They learned the sound of a mechanical fault through a hull. They crossed the Devil's Gardens one tape width at a time. And somewhere in those nights, the laughter in Berlin grew thin. The break-in became a breakout. Rommel withdrew. The rats pursued. And pursuit, the first love of anyone who commands armor, is also the first place where arrogance can spend itself to death. The rats did not sprint blind. They leapfrogged supplies. They kept leap distances measured in Bowser ranges. They seized wells and junctions instead of names. At Fuka and at Mersa Matruh and across the Libyan frontier, they cut. Fuel convoys strangled under eyes in the sky. The Desert Air Force acted like a hawk. The Navy laid traps for the Axis supply line that had once been a silver rope and was now a frayed thread. Benghazi, the recaptured prize the Germans had counted like a coin, fell again. The frontier wire, a relic and a symbol, passed under tracks that did not slow. The long, weary seesaw of the western desert ended as a slope. One direction only, west. The Germans had explanations, terrain, numbers. The Americans arriving with crates that carried new smells and new labels, M4, M7, 75mm, aviation gasoline in drums that never seemed to run dry. The British had something less dramatic and more decisive. Procedure, a practical science of desert war that looked like superstition until it was measured. Recoveries planned, not hoped. Tank state briefed like weather. Radiators flushed on a schedule. Ammunition loads chosen for tasks, not fears. The jerboa on the fender stood for all of it, a small animal that survives deserts because it knows when to sprint and when to sit still. Early 1943. Tripoli. The rats rolled under palms that had meant more to posters than to men, and the port cranes clanked the way they clank in victorious footage that seems inevitable in hindsight and felt impossible the week before it happened. The German generals still had their habits. They wrote tight reports. They underlined words. They used the word if like a talisman, if supplies, if replacements, if time. The desert uses the word now. Montgomery planned the Marath Line assault like an engineer looks at a dam. Pressure points, overflows, sluice gates, feints as fluid tests. The rats went where it counted, along wadis that looked harmless from the air and were lethal from the ground, along tracks that had been smoothed by donkey carts and were widened by chain and bulldozer. The French on the left punched through hills that looked like piles of sleeping lions. The rats did their part with an instrument they had tuned for 3 years. A moving front that never rolled faster than its Bowsers and never halted longer than its grease guns. Wadi Akarit, El Hama, Gabes, Sfax. The names came faster. The German generals stopped mocking and started revising. Reports that had once compared British crews unfavorably to German gunnery now compared British maintenance favorably to German desperation. A panzer is a fine thing until a track pin shears 50 miles from a workshop, and then it is a sculpture. The desert rats had learned to make workshops in the lee of a dune, to cannibalize with a ledger, to trade parts across regiments without paperwork and with perfect memory. They could pull a final drive in the time it takes a staff conference to assign blame. And that is what victory looks like on a Tuesday when no one writes a bulletin. In Tunisia, the war tightened. The desert lost its horizontals and found its thorns. Ridges, olive groves, river bends that mattered more than symbols. The Americans bled at Kasserine and learned fast. The British tightened like a vice from the south. The rats met the enemy now not as abstractions across a sea of heat, but as silhouettes at 2,000 yards, then 1,200, then 600. The 6-pounders bit hard. The 25-pounders walked barrages with a surveyor's confidence. The tanks moved as if the ground were a memory they had already rehearsed, because it was. They had fought for 3 years for this, not a parade, not a line in a communiqué, but the knowledge of how to do the next thing right, under fire, with dust in their mouth and grit in the oil. A German staff officer, once generous with adjectives like clumsy and timid, stood on a ridge near Enfidaville and watched a British armoured brigade pass in echelon and understood something that the desert had been teaching for 1,000 miles. The enemy you mock becomes the teacher you fear. Vehicles that do not break, units that do not panic, commanders who do not gamble away petrol for headlines. There is a power in competence that does not swagger because it has no spare breath. May 1943. The end in Africa looked like statistics because endings do. 250,000 Axis prisoners. Columns that had been lists on a staff map became lines of men with empty hands. The German generals wrote their last reports in Africa with tones they had reserved for weather. Impersonal, inevitable. The desert rats did not write epilogues. They serviced their tracks because ships were waiting, and the Jerboa would be painted again in a new theatre with hedgerows instead of wadis and lanes instead of compass bearings. But the nickname that had sounded like a joke to Berlin in 1940 had become a warning in 1943. Do not underestimate the animal that lives in the sun. What broke the myth of German invincibility in the desert was not a single genius move, not a duel of aces, not a romantic charge. It was the slow, relentless elevation of standards, gunnery sharpened by practice, not legend, maintenance held like a religion, not an afterthought, supply that treated water as a weapon and fuel as a verdict. Reconnaissance that mapped the invisible, the corrugations that crack suspensions, the salt pans that promise speed and deliver bogging. A culture that allowed a corporal's idea about air filters to cross a brigade in a week because it saved engines. The rats built that culture in heat that curdles thought. They kept it when failure would have been more dramatic. There were moments that made footage. Stuart lights ringed with dust, skittering between columns. Shermans cresting one at a time to fire and drop, a metronome of muzzle flashes against a ridge, 25-pounders firing over open sights when the line needed a spine, and there was no time to call for someone else's courage. There were the ordinary miracles the camera never sees. A fitter's hands black to the wrist, pulling a pump apart in the dark by touch. A signaler's calm voice on a net crowded with fear. A sergeant counting trucks at a crossroads by headlight patterns and knowing if a battalion would drink by dawn. The desert rats fought with all of this, not just with their turrets. German generals mocked. They always do at first. They mocked a Jerboa logo. They mocked a habit of tea. They mocked a doctrine written in pencil on the bonnet of a lorry. And then they watched their map shrink. They watched their petrol burn in someone else's plan. They watched minefield gaps open and widen and never close. They watched night become an ally of men who used to fear it. They watched a division that had learned humility become a division that taught it. The last convoys out of Africa did not carry victory. They carried an education that would be applied somewhere colder and greener. The desert rats, who had learned to read an unkind sky, landed in a country with hedges and stone walls and rain. The Germans, who had once written that British tanks could not be trusted to press an attack, had long since stopped writing in that tone. They respected what had beaten them, a force that got better under pressure, an enemy that refused to make the same mistake twice, a division that hid professionalism under humor and ferocity under restraint. The desert does not flatter. It exposes. It exposed the lies about easy war. It exposed the vanity of generals who thought maneuver is a costume you put on rather than a craft you practice by torchlight. It exposed any army that believed supply is beneath honor, that maintenance is a chore, that doctrine is a speech. The desert rats were not a miracle. They were an answer to heat, to distance, to an enemy who believed mockery is a strategy. They answered with miles, with bearings, with routines that looked dull and won battles. In the end, Africa did what it always does to invaders who arrive with certainty and leave with explanations. It taught. The British 7th Armoured Division arrived as a collection of units and left as a creature. The Germans arrived with a legend and left with a lesson. The laughter died somewhere east of Tripoli, smothered under the sound of engines that start in the morning, guns that can be laid in a sandstorm, men who know where they are in a world that wants to erase the compass. The desert rats drove the Axis out of Africa, not because they were lucky, not because the enemy was doomed, but because competence is a weapon that never jams. So remember the things that look small in photographs. The jerboa stenciled on a glacis plate, the canvas water bags bleeding dark patches on a turret side, the tapes snaking through a minefield in the moonlight, the grease pencil notes on a periscope guard, the way a column halts in the exact order that lets it start again without confusion. Those are not decorations. Those are victory. The German generals mocked the desert rats, and then they learned the cost of contempt. It is paid in miles. It is paid in prisoners. It is paid in the quiet, unphotogenic work that turns a division into a blade. In Africa, under a sun that forgives nothing, the rats made that blade, honed it, and used it. And when the killing stopped, the map agreed with them. May 1943. The smoke still hung over Tunisia like a veil that refused to rise. On docks, crowded with surrendered vehicles and rusting drums, the desert rats refueled, not for rest, but for embarkation. Their war in Africa had ended, but the craft they had forged there was only beginning its journey. In the Mediterranean sun, their tanks bore scars that looked like medals, paint scoured by sand, filters patched with mesh and cloth. Mechanics marked the hulls with chalk instructions: flush, check final drive, replace seals, and then watched cranes lift them onto ships bound for another continent. They had spent 3 years fighting a war of distances. Now they would learn to fight a war of obstacles. 2. The Mediterranean crossings were calm, but the minds aboard were not. The rats had seen what desert arrogance costs. They had seen how generals who mock become students and how men who adapt survive. In Sicily, they would apply the syllabus they had written in sand. The invasion plans looked like another compass bearing, another leap into terrain drawn by men who had never walked it. Amphibious landings, dust instead of dunes, but the same heat. A new kind of enemy, mountain, olive grove, stone wall. Rommel was gone, but his disciples remained, dug into ridges that could hide entire divisions. Sicily, July 1943. The rats came ashore near Avola and found that the enemy had traded sand for stone, mirage for haze. The roads were ribbons of dust too narrow for armored columns, and the bridges were the first victims of retreating engineers. Yet the tempo felt familiar. They had learned in Africa that motion itself can be a weapon. The same rhythm guided them now. Move before the enemy can count, flank before he can plan, strike before he can breathe. The Italian defenses folded quickly. The German rearguards fought like craftsmen delaying fate. The rats pushed north through Nicosia, Troina, Randazzo. Each name was a rock, each mile another echo of the desert. Only now, every horizon ended in a hill. In August, they looked down from the slopes of Mount Etna at a sea of Allied shipping so vast that it dwarfed anything they had imagined possible in the desert years. The Empire's colonial army, once mocked as a relic, now formed the backbone of an expeditionary force that spanned oceans. The Germans had called them provincial amateurs. Now the rats were the template for mobile warfare across 3 continents. When the campaign moved to mainland Italy, the rats crossed at Reggio Calabria, engines drumming across pontoon bridges built in record time. The fighting there had a new flavor: dust mixed with rain, heat replaced by mud, and the enemy using terrain like a shield. But desert habits die hard. They improvised again: chains on tracks, tarpaulins for traction, reconnaissance by smell and rumor. Where Rommel's tanks had once ruled open ground, now German tigers lurked behind stone walls. The rats learned again that adaptability outruns pedigree. At Salerno, artillery drowned conversation. At Volturno, sappers worked knee-deep in floodwater. At Cassino, the rats learned humility from a monastery that refused to fall. The desert's clear horizons were gone. Now they fought through villages where every window could hide a gun, every vineyard could conceal a mine. Yet the voice on the radio still sounded the same: calm, precise, clipped, with that mixture of understatement and steel that had carried them through Africa. In Italy, the desert rats taught new allies what Africa had taught them: that fuel is life, that wireless discipline saves lives, that every tank is a promise to its crew only if the fitter keeps it breathing. American units watched how the rats managed convoys, 1 hour apart, lights doused, engines checked at every halt, and copied it. Polish and Indian brigades took note of how they marked minefields with tape and petrol cans, a system born under Egyptian stars and perfected under Italian rain. Doctrine traveled faster than rumor. By the winter of 1944, the rats had become a brand within the Allied armies. Their Jerboa emblem appeared on training pamphlets. Their maintenance tables were translated into multiple languages. The men who had once fought for water now advised on snow chains. Rommel himself, writing reports from his new front in France, still referred to them by name. "The British 7th Armoured," he wrote, "remains the most experienced mobile formation in the enemy's arsenal. They are quick to exploit, slow to panic, and led by officers who understand both machine and man." It was a grudging compliment from the one German general whose praise mattered most. Spring 1944. The Mediterranean wind smelled of salt and oil. Ships lined the docks from Naples to Taranto, loaded with equipment that had learned the art of travel. The rats were ordered north, not to Rome, but to England. The men packed with a veteran's efficiency, tins of tea, tool rolls, Lucky Charms, and left behind the graves of comrades in Tunisian soil. On the long voyage through Gibraltar and up the Atlantic, they drilled in briefings that spoke of Operation Overlord, beaches, cliffs, hedgerows. Another landscape to decode, another chance to prove that mobility is a mindset, not a map. In England, they found a different kind of desert. Hedges that made sightlines claustrophobic, rain that made engines sulk, mud that swallowed half-tracks whole. The training grounds of Norfolk and Salisbury looked nothing like Libya, yet the rats approached them with the same curiosity they had once given to dunes. They studied how to drive through orchard lanes, how to use infantry screens in confined country, how to coordinate with typhoons overhead. The desert had taught them independence. Normandy would demand cooperation. The invasion of Europe was a calendar waiting to be torn. June 1944. The rats were not among the first on D-Day. Their landing came days later, when the beaches were secure, but the bocage still hid teeth. The Germans who faced them now were not the green divisions of 1941. They were veterans, hardened, fortified, desperate. The desert rats entered Normandy with the confidence of men who had already seen the impossible undone. They knew that war is less about courage than about persistence measured in gallons and gears. In the battle for Villers-Bocage, that persistence met its most famous test. The rats advanced through narrow lanes bordered by hedgerows that turned every bend into a potential ambush. A single German tiger, commanded by Michael Wittmann, burst from concealment and cut into the column like a scythe. The destruction was surgical. Dozens of British vehicles lost in minutes. Newsreels in Berlin hailed it as revenge for Africa. But the story did not end with fire. Within 48 hours, the rats regrouped, analyzed, adapted. They changed formation doctrine, rewrote spacing orders, and returned to fight through the same countryside until the hedges themselves became allies rather than traps. The Germans filmed their triumph. The rats wrote the sequel. As the Allies broke through to Falaise, the rats were again at the spearhead, their Shermans running hard in clouds of dust that looked almost like home. In that pocket, the last organized German army in France disintegrated under pressure that combined air power, armor, and logistics, an echo of the desert in the green heart of Europe. The rats cut roads, blocked bridges, turned fields into ambushes, and watched from their turrets as thousands of German prisoners trudged east under the same sun that had once beaten on prisoners in Afrika. War has a cruel symmetry. After Normandy, they crossed the Seine, moved through Belgium, and entered the Low Countries with engines still rattling from sand that had been trapped in gearboxes since Tunisia. Mechanics joked that Africa was following them. In reality, it was their experience that followed. The instinct to pause for maintenance, to plan refueling like a maneuver, to keep the division alive by routine. The German generals facing them, many of whom had once mocked British armor, now wrote reports filled with anxiety about Allied supply chains that never seemed to break. They complained that the enemy fought like a machine with endless spares. They were right. The desert rats had become the living symbol of that endurance. When the Allied advance stalled at the Rhine, the rats found themselves fighting winter rather than heat. Their engines shuddered in frost, their breath turned white inside tanks, and the ground they had once cursed for dust now froze hard as stone. Yet the rhythms of Africa remained. Every halt was a service period. Every dawn was a check of bearings. Every driver listened to his engine as a physician listens to a pulse. It kept them moving when others bogged down. By March 1945, The rats were again where history sharpens its pencil, crossing the Rhine. The river that had once marked the edge of the Reich became another line on a map waiting for erasure. Pontoon bridges trembled under the weight of tanks. Amphibious vehicles swam with improbable grace, and on the far bank the German defences collapsed like a wall eaten from within. The men who had fought in sand now rolled through forests. They called it the last lap, but they treated every mile as if Rommel himself still waited over the next ridge. In April they liberated towns that looked too peaceful to belong in a war. Children watched from doorways as the rats' columns passed, names like Hanover, Bremen, Hamburg, painted on signposts that once pointed to empire and now pointed to exhaustion. German soldiers surrendered by platoons, by companies, by regiments. Some of the same officers who had once served under the Afrika Korps recognized the jerboa emblem on British tanks and stared in disbelief. It was as if the desert itself had come north to collect its due. When the surrender came in May 1945, it was quiet, almost domestic. The desert rats bivouacked among cherry orchards, their vehicles parked in neat rows, tarps drawn like curtains. The war had begun for them under an African sunrise and ended under a European spring. They had crossed continents without changing their creed: move, adapt, survive, outlast. The German generals who had once dismissed them now cited them in studies as the prototype of modern armored warfare. One, writing in American captivity, put it simply, "They did not fight as we expected an army to fight. They fought as an organism." The rats returned home to England by degrees. Units rotated, ships unloaded, parades assembled. Crowds cheered, but the veterans knew that what they had built could not be paraded. You cannot show maintenance discipline on a reviewing stand. You cannot display a habit of cleaning filters or tightening track bolts to applause. Their legacy was invisible and indestructible, a doctrine embedded in every armored corps that followed. Post-war analysts called it the desert rat's principle: mobility married to meticulousness, aggression balanced by logistics, initiative tempered by teamwork. It shaped the British Army of the Cold War and echoed in NATO manuals decades later. In training films, young officers watched footage of the rats moving across dunes and were told, "This is how professionals learn humility without losing speed." Some of the original rats returned to Africa in peacetime. They walked the cemeteries at El Alamein, Tobruk, and Halfaya Pass, where the wind still sounds like engines idling. Others visited Germany, not as conquerors, but as guests of a country rebuilding under principles they had unknowingly helped to teach: discipline, planning, engineering, democracy's faith in method. In every reunion between old enemies, there was a line that came up sooner or later: "We underestimated you." And the answer, always modest, always English: "Most people do, until we start the engines." The transformation that began in the desert had reshaped armies and continents. It had shown that competence defeats bravado, that endurance defeats theatrics, that the mocker eventually salutes the mocked. The desert rats had been called many things: colonials, improvisers, relics, but history wrote the final epithet in their favor: professionals. By the time the Cold War drew its iron curtain, the lessons of Africa had migrated into every armored doctrine from Kansas to Kiev. The importance of maintenance cycles, of logistics pacing, of decentralized initiative, all of it traced back to the dunes. The Germans had given the world blitzkrieg. The desert rats had given it sustainability. In regimental museums today, a small stuffed jerboa sits in a glass case, its fur faded, its ears cocked as if listening for engines on the wind. The plaque beneath it reads, "They mocked us once." It does not need to add what happened after. Because every convoy that starts on time, every machine that rolls when it should, Every commander who treats fuel as strategy carries the ghost of that lesson. The desert rats did not just drive the Axis out of Africa, they drove hubris out of modern warfare. They taught the world that the true empire is mastery over one's own craft. And somewhere in the desert, under a sky still too big for pride, the wind still writes their signature in the sand. Summer, 1945. The war was over, but the habits of war do not end when the shooting stops. They fade slowly, like the smell of oil in the seams of a uniform. The desert rats returned home to find streets too narrow for their memories. The noise of tanks had been replaced by the hum of trams, the clang of milk bottles on doorsteps. For years they had measured time by convoys, miles, bearings, not by clocks. Now they stood at railway platforms waiting for trains that ran on timetables instead of orders. The quiet unnerved them more than the guns ever had. Many of them found that England had changed while they were gone, but not as much as they had changed inside. Civilians asked them what the desert was like, and they struggled for words. You could describe the sand, the heat, the flies, but not the feeling. The sense of distance that stripped away pretense, the discipline that became instinct, the comradeship born from scarcity. Some men missed the clarity. In war, everything was simplified to survival. In peace, everything grew complicated again. The British Army demobilized by the hundreds of thousands, but not the rats. The 7th Armored Division remained intact, a symbol too valuable to dissolve. They became the living proof that mobility and professionalism had conquered fascism. Children who had never seen Africa now watched them parade through London streets, the jerboa emblem gleaming on turrets, polished to mirror sheen. Newspapers called them the ghosts of the desert, though ghosts rarely carry so much pride. At the same time, in Germany, a new frontier was forming. The old Reich had collapsed into zones, and the Allies who had fought together now eyed each other with suspicion. The Cold War was beginning to whisper through the rubble. For Britain, weary and rationed, the empire was shrinking, but its soldiers still stood guard where the map demanded it. The desert rats were assigned to occupation duty in the British zone of Germany. A strange irony, watching the country they had fought now rebuilding with Allied guidance. The veterans found themselves instructing young German mechanics on how to service vehicles, advising municipal engineers on fuel storage, even sharing cigarettes with former enemies who now carried Allied work permits. In Hamburg, a former Wehrmacht officer approached a British sergeant at a motor pool and asked, in careful English, "How did you keep your tanks moving, even in sand?" The sergeant grinned. "Discipline," he said, "and a bit of swearing." It was not a joke. It was doctrine distilled into one sentence. From 1946 to 1948, the rats became custodians rather than conquerors. They patrolled roads lined with displaced persons, guarded depots of food and coal, and watched a defeated people learn democracy through paperwork and patience. Many who had fought in the desert now believed that victory had to be maintained the same way engines are, by regular maintenance, not by speeches. They treated the fragile peace as they had treated their machines. Check the pressure, tighten the bolts, keep it running. But peace did not last long in the empire. By 1948, Britain faced new crises: Palestine, Malaya, Korea. The world had changed, but the need for mobility and readiness had not. The desert rats were deployed again, first as part of the British Army of the Rhine, then as a rapid reaction force wherever the Union Jack was still expected to enforce order. Their tanks were new, Centurions now, sleek and powerful, but their ethos was the same. Before every exercise, sergeants still muttered the old desert prayer: "Keep her running, keep her breathing, and she'll get us home." In the early 1950s, the rats trained in the plains of northern Germany, landscapes that were green instead of golden, but just as vast. The Cold War made soldiers out of economists, map-makers, meteorologists. The enemy was no longer Rommel's Afrika Korps, but a faceless tide of armor from the east. The desert lessons proved timeless. Logistics win wars before they start. The British command structured its armored corps around those principles: regular servicing, predictable movement, modular supply lines. NATO would later call it interoperability. The rats just called it common sense. Every new generation learned from the veterans who had served in sand and sun. Young lieutenants studied the diaries of their predecessors, how they navigated by the stars, how they calculated fuel loads by instinct, how they kept discipline without tyranny. The desert was gone, but its ghosts lived in every maintenance hangar and every tactical classroom. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, some of the older rats were sent as advisors to Commonwealth units. They watched with weary amusement as reporters described Korea's mountains as deserts of ice. They understood the metaphor. They knew that terrain only changes the color of difficulty, not its shape. Back in Europe, the rats took part in the great reorganization of British forces. By 1952, the division had become part of NATO's deterrent shield, stationed permanently in Germany. Their tanks pointed east, but their traditions pointed backward to Africa. The Jerboa insignia was now stitched not just on British uniforms, but on joint training manuals. Americans and Canadians learned its meaning: survival through preparation, victory through professionalism. One American colonel, visiting a British camp near Hanover, asked a question that would become legend. Why the jerboa? Why not a lion or a hawk? The answer came from a grizzled warrant officer who had served at El Alamein. Because the jerboa lives where nothing should live, he said. It survives by knowing the desert better than the predators do. The colonel nodded. That'll do. In 1954, when Winston Churchill visited the division in Germany, he stood before the troops and said, "The desert rats are not just a division. They are a tradition, one that teaches that victory is a craft, not a miracle." The men cheered softly. They had heard similar words before, but from him they sounded like closure. For many, it was the first time the world had truly acknowledged that their endurance, not just their courage, had changed the war's direction. The following decades turned the desert rats from a fighting force into a legend. But legends, when maintained by professionals, do not fossilize. They evolve. During the Suez Crisis in 1956, elements of the division stood ready for deployment, though political decisions kept them largely in reserve. They watched the empire falter on television sets in mess halls, the grainy footage of paratroopers descending over Port Said, the hurried withdrawals. It was not defeat, but it felt like aging. The rats realized that history had moved from deserts of sand to deserts of diplomacy. Still, their craft remained. In 1967, the division was reduced to a brigade, a leaner force, but still carrying the name that had terrified and inspired across 3 continents. They trained with NATO in exercises like Lionheart and Reforger, perfecting the art of rapid movement across Europe. Journalists who visited their maneuvers noted the same discipline, the same casual professionalism. A sergeant polishing his Centurion turret was asked by a reporter what had changed since Africa. He replied, "Only the weather and the excuses." By the 1970s, the rats were part of Britain's identity. Films, books, and documentaries romanticized their desert battles, though the men who had lived them rarely watched. They found the dramatizations too neat, too loud. The real desert had been quieter, more patient, but they were proud that the lessons endured. Military academies around the world studied the North African campaign not as nostalgia, but as blueprint, how to combine limited resources, how to maintain initiative, how to turn adversity into doctrine. The rats themselves continued to adapt. Their tanks became chieftains, then challengers, each one more complex, more powerful, but still subject to the same law. A machine is only as reliable as the man who maintains it. The veterans drilled that truth into recruits with the same dry humor they had used under Rommel's artillery. "You want to know how to beat the enemy?" one instructor would say. "Make sure your engine starts." Meanwhile, in Germany, a new generation of British and German soldiers trained side by side. Joint maneuvers blurred the old animosities. Officers who had once studied each other as enemies now shared maps, cigarettes, and laughter. In 1983, during an exercise near Lüneburg Heath, an elderly German observer approached the British camp, his uniform long since traded for civilian clothes. On his lapel was a tiny iron cross. He shook hands with a British colonel and said, "I fought you once, in Afrika. You taught us respect." The colonel smiled. "You returned the favor." By the 1990s, the desert rats had served longer in peace than they ever had in war. When the Berlin Wall fell, they were still in Germany, watching history dissolve again. Some thought the world no longer needed armored divisions. Others knew better. In 1991, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the old lessons suddenly became new again. Sand, heat, logistics, distance. The desert had returned, and the rats went with it. Operation Granby, the British contribution to the Gulf War, saw the rats driving Challenger tanks across terrain that looked uncannily like their ancestral battlefield. The parallels were eerie. Sandstorms, mirage, fuel convoys snaking across featureless horizons. Yet this time, the technology was decades ahead. Thermal sights, GPS, digital radios. What had once taken an entire map table now fit into a handheld device. But the human principles remained identical. The crews cleaned filters, checked tracks, rationed water, plotted bearings. Old veterans watching from home nodded knowingly. The desert had changed its address, but not its demands. In the brief, brutal 100-hour ground war, the rats spearheaded the advance of the British 1st Armoured Division. They destroyed over 300 Iraqi tanks with minimal losses, a performance so precise that even American generals took note. When journalists asked how they achieved such success, the commanding officer quoted Montgomery's dictum from 1942, "If you can't maintain it, you don't deserve it." The rats had turned that into an art form. After the Gulf War, the Jerboa insignia appeared again on television screens, this time in color and clarity unimaginable to the men of 1941. But what mattered was continuity, the same symbol, the same creed, carried into a new century. Young soldiers who hadn't been born when El Alamein was fought now wore the same badge on their sleeves. The circle had closed. In the following years, the rats served in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Iraq again. They learned new kinds of warfare, urban instead of open, asymmetric instead of symmetrical, but their discipline remained the same. Commanders used to joke that if you dropped a desert rat in any environment, snow, jungle, desert, he'd find the maintenance schedule before the enemy. Back home, the regiment became a touchstone of British military memory. In schools, children studied the North African campaign. In museums, the Jerboa sat beside Spitfires and code machines. Every Remembrance Day, the veterans marched with steady pace, their medals clinking softly, their berets still bearing the insignia of the desert. Few civilians knew what the little rodent symbolized, but the veterans did. It stood for endurance against arrogance, preparation against luck, method against chaos. As the 21st century advanced, technology began to change the face of warfare beyond recognition. Drones replaced scouts, satellites replaced compasses, Logistics became algorithms. Yet every new system carried within it a whisper of the old creed. Engineers designing autonomous supply convoys in Afghanistan quoted the North African campaign as precedent. The importance of redundancy, of timing, of never outrunning your support. The Desert Rats had written those principles in sand 70 years earlier. In 2011, when the division celebrated its 70th anniversary, veterans gathered in Hyde Park for a reunion. They were old now, stooped, silver-haired, but still sharp. Some arrived in wheelchairs, others with canes fashioned from old tank handles. A Challenger 2 stood nearby, gleaming under the London sky. On its turret, painted in black, was the same jerboa. The crowd fell silent as a bugler played. One veteran, a man who had driven a crusader at Gazala, looked up at the tank and murmured, "Different animal, same heart." The speeches that followed spoke not of battles, but of values, teamwork, humility, professionalism. Generals and politicians quoted the Rats as proof that excellence is not born of privilege, but of persistence. One line echoed through the ceremony, taken from a wartime diary found in the Imperial War Museum. "We were never the best because we were born that way. We became the best because the desert punished every mistake until none were left." Today, the Desert Rats still exist. Officially, the 7th Armoured Brigade Combat Team, part of the British Army's modern structure. Their vehicles are digital now, their maps electronic, their communications encrypted. But on every patch of tan camouflage cloth, the jerboa remains. It has outlived empires, ideologies, and even the deserts that gave it meaning. When young recruits ask veterans what it stands for, the answers vary. Some say survival, some say pride. One old tank commander at a training camp near Salisbury Plain gave the truest answer of all. "It stands for proof," he said. "Proof that method beats myth. That the men they laughed at once ended up writing the manual everyone still uses. Because the story of the Desert Rats is not just military history. It's a study in human transformation, a lesson in how adversity forges identity, how ridicule sharpens resolve. The German generals who mocked them created their own undoing by underestimating men who refused to be what they were labeled. Every successful system in the modern world, from logistics networks to emergency planning, owes a quiet debt to that mindset. Start small, learn fast, never stop improving. And when the sun sets over the Libyan sands, or the German plains, or the English countryside where they now train, that mindset endures, a faint echo of engines, a discipline that outlasts uniforms, a symbol that no longer belongs to war, but to history's larger lesson, that dignity in work, care in detail, and steadiness under pressure will always outfight arrogance and noise. The Desert Rats drove their tanks out of Africa, but what they truly drove out was illusion. The illusion that genius alone wins wars, that flair beats structure, that noise beats silence. They proved that the quiet men, the ones who count bolts and bearings, who plan convoys and clean filters, are the ones who make victory inevitable. Every army since has chased that balance between daring and diligence, between movement and maintenance, between chaos and control. Few have found it as completely as the Desert Rats did between 1940 and 1943. And every time a modern tank unit moves with perfect timing, every time an army advances with fuel, food, and morale intact, the desert whispers its old approval. They remembered. The mockery that began in the Reich's briefing rooms has long since turned to admiration. The men who once laughed at the idea of colonial soldiers mastering mechanized war would live to see their own doctrines rewritten with British footnotes. The Desert Rats changed more than battles. They changed the way professional armies think about themselves. And so, when history speaks of the deserts of North Africa, It no longer begins with Rommel's brilliance or German efficiency. It begins with the men who turned humility into weaponry. It begins with the jerboa, the small survivor that never stopped moving. It begins with the desert rats, who taught the world that survival is not a gift, but a skill.